Collector, and as you know, in the process of collecting taxes, often his normal everyday function of his job would be accounting. He would have to settle the books. He would have to reconcile with people. He would know what certain people owed, and he would come along and point out exactly what they owed, and it's time to pay. He gives us a parable here. This is undoubtedly comes off of the lips of the historical Jesus as it is written here today. But Matthew records this parable, and it is only recorded in his gospel. And there is one similar to it in the book of Luke, chapter 19, verses 11 through 27. It's called the parable of the 10 minas. This is often referred to as the parable of the talents. It is a very familiar parable to you. You will not be taken off guard, and you have heard it before. Matthew chapter 25, open your Bibles, verses 14 through 30 this morning. This is the third parable in a trilogy of parables. He began the first parable at the end of chapter 24, verses 45 through 51. This parable that we're looking at today has similar characteristics to that first parable. It is about there is going to be a lengthy time between Jesus' ascension and his return. And also what is required in between his ascension and return is faithfulness. And so open your Bibles this morning. Chapter 25, verse 14 is where we're going to begin this morning. Notice here in this the first thing I want to give you is the task given to the servants. The task given to the servants. Is a parable, it is a story, and here we go. It says in verses 14 through 18, "For the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country." And by the way, kingdom of heaven is not in the original. That was inserted there. It is a situation like the first one, and the second one, which was about the kingdom of heaven. But don't forget that what we're talking about here is the return of Jesus. And so the consummation of the kingdom of heaven will occur at the return of Jesus. So this is a situation much like the previous two, verses 45 through 51. You're going to have to look back. Look at verse 45. Jesus said in response to when will be the sign of your coming? Who then is a faithful and wise servant? There Jesus was talking about what is required in between. Well, it's faithfulness and it's wisdom. It's to be a good servant in between. It's always waiting on his coming. And while he is gone, we're going to be faithful. Look at verse 1 of chapter 25. "Then shall the kingdom of heaven be likened," and we saw the 10 bridesmaids, and there were 5 who were what? They were wise, and they were prepared. There were 5 that were unprepared, and they were called what? They were called what? Foolish. They were called foolish. And so you see this continuing contrast here between the wise and the faithful, and the foolish and the unfaithful. And he comes here in this third parable, and he reinforces the first parable. The first parable and the third parable have this in common. So what? Jesus is coming. So what? He is coming again. So I'm going to sit idly here and just wait. I'm just going to have my hands folded up, and I'm just going to wait patiently on his return and do nothing. That's not what Jesus says. Jesus says, here is the so what of my return. Always be ready. That's a good start. Be ready. But what does readiness mean? Well, readiness means being wise and faithful, not uncommitted, not having the wrong attitude towards God, not doing nothing. That's not what he expects. He expects wise and faithful living, which also means commitment to him. You know, there's a lot of people who they're not sold, are they? They don't buy into this thing of Jesus. They don't buy into the thing of that He's coming back. They have a perverted sense about God. They think, well, that's not the way it's going to be. It's going to be like this. They've made their own story up. They've disregarded God's word, and they have their own little perverted logic about God. Now watch what happens here in verse 14. It is like a man traveling into a far country who called his own servants. And that's very key. You might want to take note of that. Called his servants. Another key word is own servants. He called his own servants and delivered unto them his goods. And unto one he gave 5 talents, and to another 2, and to another 1. To every man according to his several ability. And straightway took his journey. Then he that had received the 5 talents went and traded with the same, and made them other 5 talents. And likewise he that had received 2, he also gained the other 2. But he that had received 1 went and digged in the earth and hid his Lord's money. Well, I mean, it sounds like all 3 of them did the right thing, didn't they? Well, let's find out what Jesus says. Here in these opening few verses, these are the tasks that are given to his servants. Notice the first thing here is that we are told in the first 2 verses the whole scenario. The whole scenario is that there is a king, there is a ruler, and he has an enormous amount of wealth. And he is going to distribute his wealth to, for an example here, 3 different people. These 3 people represent, no doubt, the entire scope of humanity. And it says here that the reason that he distributes differently to each one, what is the reason for that? It's right there in the text, isn't it? Right there, according to each one's ability. Not everyone is able to do certain things. Not everyone is expected to do certain things. But to each one, God has given something to them. I think it goes even to, and I'm going to get to this at the very end. I think it comes down to, it's this simple. God has given you breath in your lungs. Every person has been given something from God. You have received life. You have received health. You have received an opportunity. God has given everyone something. And so then what do we do with what God has given us? That's the big question, isn't it? Well, by the way, how much is a talent? I want you to hear this. A talent is a measurement of weight. It is not necessarily a measurement of currency, but Jesus intends it to mean a measurement of weight of some kind of currency like gold or silver. Let's say, it doesn't say that it is, but let's say that it is 1 talent of gold. A talent it weighs 75 to 100 pounds. Let's say that it's 100 pounds. I looked up the going currency rate for gold this morning. Do you know what gold is worth? Today, gold is worth $1,709 an ounce. That's how much it's worth. If you multiply $1,700 times 16 ounces, that will give you the value of 1 pound of gold. Multiply it by 100, and if you have a calculator, do it. From what I remember, I think it's something like $2.7 million for 100 pounds of gold. That's what it's worth today. Multiply that by 5, and that is what 5 talents is worth. This ruler gave one of them about $13 million. He gave another one about $5.8 million. And then he gave one of them $2.7 million. This is a fortune. God has blessed them abundantly. He has given them and distributed them blessings that abound. This is not a blessing that you would ever take for granted or want to take for granted. And so all of them received a different amount. But notice here, the second thing I want to show you in this first little section is what they did with it. Notice in verse 16, the one who received 5, he used what God gave him. Now this is very key. He used what God gave him, and he was able to come out with some type of profit. He doubled his profit, didn't he? He had 5 to work with, and he came out, and he got 5 back. And then verse 17, the one who got 2, he gained 2. He went out, he said, you know what? I may not be as blessed as the other guy, but God's blessed me. Hey, this person over here, oh, look at all this that God's given him, and I've been given this, but I'm still going to work for the Lord. I'm not going to have my eyes over there all the time in jealousy and envy. I'm just going to work with what God gave me. God gave me this. I'm going to work with it. And look at the result. The result is the same. The initiative is the same. Both of them are committed. Both of them see it as a blessing, as a treasure, and they go to work and they take initiative. And then they both have the same result. It doubles on them. And then the third one, what does he do with it? Well, he doesn't do anything with it, does he? Except he buries it. He takes his blessing that God gave him, or what the master gave him, the ruler gave him, and he takes it and he digs a hole and he buries it. He hides it. He does nothing with it. He doesn't go out and work with it like the other ones do. He does nothing. He digs a hole. He hides it. He's going to keep it safe for his Lord. That's what he thinks. Well, notice here in verse 18, he who received 1 went and digged in the earth and hid his Lord's money. The second thing I want you to see here are the results of these servants. Notice here in verse 19, the results of the servants. It says, after a long time, the Lord of those servants come and reckon with them. And this is what we were talking about a while ago, this settling of accounts. One day Jesus is going to come back, and there's going to be a settling of accounts. He is going to come back, and he is going to make all the wrongs right, and he's going to make all the rights right. He is going to settle things and balance the books. Now watch this in verse 20. And so he that had received 5 talents came and brought other 5 talents. By the way, this Greek word for brought here, it is used most of the time in the Bible for bringing something to God, bringing a sacrifice to God. Isn't that interesting? And I know that the people who originally read this and the words that when Jesus spoke them, they would pick up on that, and they would be brought into that imagery of bringing something to God, presenting something to God. Here you go. This is how I want to honor you. So they're coming in this posture of reverence, and they're coming in this posture of obedience to the Lord, and they're bringing something back to God. Now watch this. This one with 5 talents, he brought his other 5 talents, saying, Lord, thou hast given me 5 talents. Behold, I have gained beside them 5 talents more. He presented it to the Lord. And what does God say about this? Does he say, well, you should have had 6. You should have had 8. Why in the world did you squander my 5 talents? You should have had 10. Is that what he says? That's not what he says. That's the perverted attitude that he is teaching against here. That's that wrong attitude towards God that people have out there. Watch this. He says, this is what you want to hear. Well done, good and faithful servant. That's what you want to hear. When you stand before God someday, and you will stand before God someday, you want to hear God say, well done, you have been faithful, and you are good. Now watch what happens. You have been faithful over a few things. Are you kidding me? Lord, you blessed me with $13 million. More money than way above any average amount of blessings that anyone has ever had. And God says, those little things that I gave you, that piddly stuff that I gave you, boy, it sure does put some things in a different perspective, doesn't it? Sometimes there's people out there that they're so rich that they start to congratulate themselves and they start to attribute their success to themselves. And they forget about that there is a God who's going to take an accounting someday. And then there are people who are your average person, and they're bitter, they're angry. They think, why didn't God give me more? Why does God give this person more and this person less? What God says, that little stuff that I gave you in your life, you've been good, you've been a good steward of it, you've been faithful in these little things. And now I'm going to promote you. Not just promotion to heaven, though, but a promotion in a sense of reward. He is going to give them even more responsibility in eternity. Did you know that? In the parable of the 10 minas in Luke, he said to that one, I'm going to make you in charge of 10 cities. You can rest assured that in the end times, in the end of days, when Jesus' kingdom is consummated, that his people are going to be rulers over many things. There's going to be a reward. It's going to be vastly different in that time. Now watch this. He says, enter into the joy of thy Lord. And so there is also that aspect of entry. There's that aspect of acceptance there. There is that aspect of going into a realm that you were not before. And this doesn't mean that the harder I work, and if I can work hard enough, then I will gain acceptance. That's not what he's saying. He's just saying, here are the blessings, and these could range from all the way down, as I stated a while ago, all the way from the top as spiritual gifts to all the way to the bottom as something as little as the breath in your lungs. Everybody's got breath in their lungs, don't they? And then some people who are born again have spiritual gifts. But all these things are the full range of all of the blessings of God that these talents represent. And the one who had 2, he had less. He went out, and guess what? He presented the same way, the 2 talents. I've gained 2 more talents, Lord. Well, I'm sure that God's going to say, well, you know what? You're not as good as this guy over here, but it's all right. That's not what he says, is it? He says the same thing. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in these little things. I'm going to make you a ruler over much. Enter into the joy of the Lord. Same result. The one who had 5 talents, he went and he worked with what God gave him. The one who had 2 talents, he worked with what God gave him. It was different, but it was the same result. Enter into the joy of the Lord. Now, what happened to guy number 3? Let's look at it. Look at this third one. Then he which had received the 1 talent came and said, and by the way, did you notice that? All 3 stand before God. Now, this is not, you don't have to use this as a premise to believe that there is one judgment. I think the Bible talks about 2 judgments. There is the judgment seat of Christ, and there is the great white throne judgment. In this parable, for the purposes of the parable, there's not a differentiation made. There's not one needed. This probably doesn't happen at one judgment. This probably happens at 2 judgments. And here we are at one of the judgments. And the third one, the one who dug a hole, he had 1 talent, and he came and said this, I knew that thou art a hard man, reaping where thou hast not sown, and gathering where thou hast not strawed. This person has a very different view of God, doesn't he? He has a view of God that seems to be unfair to him. He seems to have a view of God that is too strict and it's harsh, and he is somewhat cruel. You know, there's people that grace the doors of some of the Lord's churches every day. They have a view of God like this. There are people in the world and they have that view of God. Well, you say, well, I'm glad they believe in God, but they don't believe in God and they have not been good and faithful to Him. They believe there is a God. They believe there is a Jesus. In fact, I would take it so far to say that there are some that have made a profession and they are operating and living their life under the guise of being a professed believer, but done nothing with what God has given them. They are content. They are content to be associated and identify with the people of God. Oh, I acknowledge God's blessings, and so I took God's blessing and I dug a hole and stuck it in the ground because I know that God sometimes is cruel and He's harsh. And I've got a plan. I'm going to give that talent back to Him. I'm going to give that gift back to Him. I'm going to give what He's blessed me with, and I'm going to give it back. And we're even Stephen. You know why? Because that person thinks he's more fair than God. He doesn't. You know what that's called? That's called, I don't trust you. I don't trust you, God. You've done things in my life and you've rained down things in my life that's made me bitter. You've done things to me and I just don't believe that everything. I don't trust everything. And so I see that you've blessed me with this, but I'm going to protect it and I'm going to hide you. And I'm going to give back everything to you that I owe you. You know what another thing that's called besides not trusting God? They don't believe in the grace of God. Number 3, they're working. Dear friend, you don't work for your salvation. But God, sometimes when you've not been fair with me, I've been fair with you. Here's your blessing. I've kept it safe for you. I'm going to give it back. I don't owe you anything. That's his attitude. But the most damaging, and I'm going to say most damning thing that he has done, he's never committed to the Lord. Never made a commitment. The one who had 5 talents, they have committed their whole life. Everything that God gave me, I'm going to go out and I'm going to work with it and I'm going to use it to the glory of God and to lift up the name of God and exalt His name. And some were given 5 and some were given 2, and they went out and they worked with what God gave them and they were faithful till He came back. And the other one took what God gave him and dug a hole in the ground and hid it and did nothing with it. They are not trusting. They are uncommitted to the Lord. I am fair with you. Are you going to be fair with me? And that is unfortunately the question that some will ask when they stand before God. Even when they stand before God, they will still be asking in their heart, are you going to be fair with me? It's a perverted attitude and a perspective of God in general. Let me tell you something about God. God can do anything He wants to do. And the second thing is this, and this is the most important. Listen very carefully. God has a right to make a claim on you. And third thing is, not only does he have the right to make a claim on you, he has a right to demand a profit. He has that right. And you do nothing with what God has given you. The very breath in your lungs, done nothing with it. And I'm going to bargain with God. And I'm going to find a way through this, and then I'm going to demand that God be fair. Watch this. I was afraid, and went and hid thy talent in the earth. Lo, there hast that is thine. His Lord answered and said unto him, this is what God says, you're a wicked and you're a lazy servant. You did know that I reap where I sowed not, and I gather where I have not strawed. You at least could have done this, he says. You should have at least taken this talent and done something with it. I don't know what was going through your mind when you were understanding the blessings of God, but you did nothing. Nothing with the blessings of God. Not a one cotton-picking thing with the blessings of God. Nothing. You were uncommitted. You were untrusting. You're wicked and you're lazy. You did nothing with it. Therefore, to have put my money to the exchangers, to take it to the bank, and then in my coming I could have gotten some interest out of it. God has a right to demand something at the end of the day. Do something with your life. Do something in your life for God. Oh, this has a range of applications, doesn't it? First of all, be saved, because accept the free gift of salvation and do something with your salvation. Are you really committed? Well, I'm saved, but have you really accepted the salvation that God has given you and placed a value on it to the point to where it motivates you to serve Him? Are you serving Him? What about spiritual gifts in your life? Has God blessed you with things that you haven't ever put to use? Dear friend, you don't have to worry about the quantity. Let me get that out in the open right now. Don't ever think that it's the quantity that it's based upon. There's no way for you to know if you ever doubled the investment. There's no way. This is a parable. This is a story. But there is a way for you to know about your quality of life. Did you ever take any initiative? Did you ever trust Him? Were you ever committed to Him? And committed to Him with the idea of doing something with what God gave you. He gave you His Son. And He died for your sins. What have you done with Jesus? He has shown you along the way little blessings to show you that He's there. What have you done with it? How have you responded? What happens to him? Take therefore the talent from him and give it unto them which hath 10 talents. That's the end of the parable. Here is the lesson that Jesus gives in verses 29 and 30. He's going to give you an explanation of it. Why did He do that? Why did the one who already had 10 now have 11? Because for unto everyone that has, and let me, I've already said it, but let me clarify it. What does he have? What does the one with 10 talents have? What does the one with 4 talents have? Well, first of all, they have what? Commitment. They've committed to God. They don't have this perverted view of God that He's cruel, that He's harsh, that He's somehow dishonest. that He's going to be unfair with me, and so I'm going to live a life, and at the end of my life, at least I can say I was fair with God, because you don't trust Him. You don't trust Him. You know, this life that we live, sometimes it doesn't seem fair, does it? It's not fair. And you know what? God never said this life was going to be fair. Let me tell you what God said, though. And you can take this to the bank. Life doesn't, and write it down, life doesn't have to be fair, but God is fair. The unfairness of life doesn't define who God is. To everyone who has the right attitude before God, to everyone who has a commitment towards God, to everyone who has trusting in God, look at this, shall be given reward and have abundance, more than you could ever ask for. This life doesn't have to be fair, but let me tell you what is. The next life is. Eternity is. There's blessing in eternity. There's people who live their lives on this earth, have been treated so harshly and cruelly, they've never experienced anything close to what fairness is. But dear friend, when they belong to God and they go into eternity, they're going to be blessed abundantly and rewarded abundantly. Watch this. Here's the other side of it. But from him that hath not commitment, trust, the right attitude towards God, shall be taken away even that which he hath. It'll all be gone. There is no bargaining with God. Standing before God and said, I've been fair with you, God. Are you going to be fair with me? Dear friend, don't ever have that attitude. Don't ever think about God like that. That God has a right to make a claim on your life. He can make that claim. You don't make claims on Him and His character. You commit to Him and you trust Him. That's what being saved is all about. Look at the last verse. And cast ye the unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I don't have to further explain what that verse means. That's pretty stock language, isn't it? For what? Condemnation. There's a shorter word for it. It's hell. The uncommitted, the one who was not trusting Him, the one who looked at God as cruel and harsh, and the one that looked at God with skepticism about God's fairness. Well, I've protected everything and I've done everything that I'm supposed to do. Here you go, God. In hell. Let me say one more thing and I'm going to get out of the way and be quiet. There's a lot of good moral people. Did you hear what I said? Moral people in hell today. They're your neighbors. They're your co-workers. Some of them might even sit on the pew with you at church. No doubt about it. Good people. But deep down inside, they have never truly committed to Jesus as their Savior. They've never trusted. they've never committed. They've operated and they've been content to be a part and associated with the people of God, but unwilling to take the next step that looks like, to a lost person, a risk. Had we been talking about business here? Business dealings? Does $13 million ring a bell? Business. There, in business, there's risk. You know what risk involves? It involves a need for courage. Let me give you a Bible word for that. It's called faith. Faith. Faith is trusting God, committing to Him, living your life for Him. And when you stand before God, you stand before a righteous and a powerful God that says, you know what? He's committed. He worked with what I gave him. He didn't yield the 100% profit, but he worked with it and he tried. But he was committed and he trusted me. And you know what God's going to say? Same thing he told the other two. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter in to the joy of the Lord. As we stand and as we sing a song of invitation, I want you to think about the words of Jesus very carefully. And I want you to reflect and ask yourself the question, have you done anything with the blessings of God? Have you trusted Him? Have you committed to Him and used His resources for His glory in your life as we sing?